Myanmar, a Southeast Asian country formerly known as Burma, has been caught in one of the most complex and devastating civil wars since 2021.
Overseas now, protests against the military coup claiming more lives in Myanmar. At least 18 people reportedly killed, the bloodiest day since the coup a month ago.
With bloodshed occurring daily, the deaths here go almost unnoticed and fail to get the same international attention as conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. This forgotten nation, located between India and China, has been in conflict for over 3 years, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and millions of displaced people. This war is tearing apart a country once seen as a hopeful example of a transition to democracy. It has shaped Myanmar's often hostile relationship with the world and led to isolation and international sanctions. This is Myanmar's civil war. It is February 2021, and Myanmar is in the middle of a military coup. The country had been going through a decade of limited democratic reforms after years of military dictatorship. But on February 1st, the army took full control of the government, arresting civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi and other elected officials. General Min Aung Hlaing declares himself the head of state. The coup triggered massive protests all over the country. Millions of people take to the streets demanding the return of the civilian government. The army responds with brutal force, shooting unarmed protesters and arresting thousands. To understand why Myanmar is fighting a civil war, we need to go back in time. The history of this conflict dates back to 1948, when the country gained independence from British rule. Since then, Myanmar has faced insurgencies and internal struggles, especially in its border regions, where various ethnic groups have sought autonomy or independence. However, on February 1st, 2021, everything changed. The Myanmar army, known as the Tatmadaw, staged a coup claiming electoral fraud in the 2020 elections that Suu Kyi's party had won again. The military arrested Suu Kyi and other civilian leaders, declared a state of emergency, and took control of the country. The response from the population was immediate and massive. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in peaceful protests, demanding the restoration of the civilian government. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, and public officials went on strike, paralysing much of the country in a civil disobedience movement. But the military junta, led by General Min Aung Hlaing, responded with a brutality reminiscent of the worst years of the dictatorship. Security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing hundreds of people in the first weeks. Thousands were arrested and tortured. Faced with this repression, many protesters decided that peaceful resistance was no longer enough. Young people from the cities fled to areas controlled by ethnic armed groups and formed the People's Defence Forces, vowing to overthrow the junta by force and pledging allegiance to a shadow government formed by ousted parliamentarians. Meanwhile, ethnic armed groups that have been fighting the central government for greater autonomy for decades saw an opportunity. Some, like the Arakan Army in Rakhine State and the Kachin Independence Army in the north, intensified their attacks against the Tatmadaw forces. Suddenly, Myanmar found itself plunged into a full-scale civil war, with fighting on multiple fronts across the country. The ethnic complexity of Myanmar plays a crucial role in this conflict. The country officially recognises 135 ethnic groups, although this number is disputed. Many of these minorities have suffered decades of marginalisation and oppression under governments dominated by the majority Bamar ethnicity. The civil war has reignited old tensions and created new alliances among these groups. Despite using different methods, they all aim to defeat the junta, a junta whose brutality knows no bounds. The army has bombed villages, burned civilians alive, and used sexual violence as a weapon of war. In April 2023, an airstrike on a gathering in the Sagaing region killed over 150 people, including women and children. While the PDF and ethnic armed groups control large areas of territory, especially in the border regions, the Tatmadaw responds with a scorched earth campaign, bombing villages, burning houses and executing civilians suspected of supporting the rebels. But the resistance has not been crushed. The People's Defence Forces and ethnic armed groups have made significant advances, capturing military bases and cities. In October 2023, an alliance of 3 ethnic armies launched a coordinated offensive that took the junta by surprise. Operation 1027, as it was known, was a turning point. The rebels captured key cities and hundreds of military posts. The Tatmadaw, once considered invincible, began to show signs of weakness. Thousands of soldiers deserted or surrendered. But beyond the fighting, the humanitarian situation in Myanmar has become catastrophic. According to the UN, more than 18 million people need urgent help. Internal displacements have reached unprecedented levels, with over 2.6 million people forced to leave their homes. The country's economy is in ruins. The COVID-19 pandemic, combined with political chaos, has devastated key sectors like tourism and manufacturing. Poverty has soared, and many people struggle to obtain basic food and medicine within the country. But this civil war isn't just Myanmar's internal issue, it has geopolitical implications that reach far beyond its borders. China, Myanmar's powerful neighbour, watches the instability on its southern border with concern. Despite officially not intervening, Beijing has economic and strategic interests at stake. Meanwhile, India worries that Myanmar's turmoil could empower insurgent groups in its own northeast. Thailand, dealing with a refugee influx, fears the conflict could spill over into its territory. And behind all this, an illicit business operating in the shadows now plays a more prominent role, so to speak. The breakdown of law and order in Myanmar has led to a surge in the production of illegal drugs. The country has become the world's largest producer of methamphetamine and heroin, surpassing even Afghanistan in opium production. Transnational criminal networks thrive, using Myanmar as a base for human trafficking, wildlife trade, and other illicit activities. This surge in organised crime has ramifications that extend far beyond Myanmar's borders. Drugs produced in the country flood markets across Asia, causing public health crises in neighbouring countries. Human trafficking fuels the sex industry in Thailand and Malaysia. Wildlife smuggled from Myanmar meets the demand for traditional medicine in China. This creates an economy that, while far from ideal, keeps the ongoing struggle afloat. By early 2024, the war enters a new phase. Rebels launch daring attacks near Naypyidaw, the fortified capital built by the generals. Although they don't manage to take the city, the attacks shake the junta's confidence and demonstrate the growing reach of the resistance. Facing desertions and supply shortages, the Tatmadaw begins forcibly recruiting civilians, including children. This sparks more resentment and resistance among the population. Reports of massive desertion start circulating, with 6 Tatmadaw generals surrendering in February 2024. In rebel-controlled areas, tensions have risen between different factions. Some ethnic armed groups don't trust the Bamar-dominated PDF and worry that a rebel victory could lead to a new centralised government, ignoring their autonomy demands. Given the current situation, these doubts are understandable. Looking ahead, by mid-2024, the war has reached a bloody stalemate. The Tatmadaw holds major cities and transport routes, but large rural areas are under rebel control. As of October 2023, it's estimated the army controlled less than 40% of the country, despite claiming 2/3 of the 330 townships. By late March 2024, opposition to the State Administration Council in southeast Myanmar seized Damoso and Papun, adding 6 district-level cities to their territory. In mid-June, the Chin resistance took Matupi, the 7th district-level city. And by late June, the Three Brotherhood Alliance restarted Operation 1027, claiming Tatmadaw ceasefire violations, and captured Kyaukma, the 8th district-level city, by month's end. In areas still under junta control, repression is getting harsher. Any form of dissent is brutally suppressed. Independent media outlets are silenced, and internet access is heavily restricted. The junta has set up a large-scale surveillance system using Chinese technology to monitor citizens' communications and movements. Meanwhile, in rebel-held areas, there are experiments with self-governance. Some show promise, trying to establish local democratic institutions. Others turn into small dictatorships led by charismatic military commanders. In Chin State, the Chin Land Defense Forces have taken over most of the state, setting up a basic civilian administration. Now, as the war nears its fourth year, Myanmar's future looks more uncertain than ever. The hope for a democratic and united Myanmar seems increasingly distant. Many worry the country could permanently split into areas controlled by rival warlords. The military junta shows no signs of giving up power, while resistance groups insist there can be no talks while the military remains in charge. The international community faces the dilemma of how to intervene without worsening the situation. Economic sanctions have had limited impact and risk hurting civilians more than military leaders. Meanwhile, the war in Myanmar continues to claim lives every day. Families are torn apart, entire communities displaced, and the future of a generation hangs in the balance. Many ask, how will this end? Can Myanmar find a way to peace and unity? Or will the country fall further into chaos and division? There are no easy answers. What's clear is that Myanmar's future will affect more than just its own borders. Stability in Southeast Asia, the balance of power between China and Western democracies, and the global struggle between authoritarianism and democracy are all at stake here. Myanmar's civil war may not receive the headlines it deserves, but its consequences will resonate far beyond its borders in the years to come. It's a war that is redefining a nation, and its outcome, whatever it may be, will shape the future not only of its own country, but of the entire region.